Hello, all you lovely spectators. I'm thrilled y'all stopped to watch my presentation. I'm Josh Klosterman. I'm an undergraduate student in the Environmental Geoscience program at the University of Buffalo. It's pretty much been a childhood dream of mine to become an entomologist, so I'm really stoked and grateful to be presenting to you all today, even if it is virtually. In the next 10 minutes, I hope to give you a look through a pixelated window into an ecological phenomenon that weaves North America's largest mammal into the life cycle of arguably some of the most important insect taxa, bees and wasps. And of course, these ecological phenomena that I am alluding to are bison wallows. Bison wallows are patches of dry, sandy, bare soil that are formed in otherwise dense grassland vegetation by the behavioral disturbances of these large mammals. And to help paint a bit of a better picture of the importance of these landscape features, prior to the extirpation of the bison from much of the North American continent, the Great Plains and Midwest would have been dotted with these open, bare spaces, and this would have created a more heterogeneous landscape than we see today in grassland systems. And right now you might be thinking, where the heck are all the bugs, Josh? This is an entomology conference. Well, it is known that some species of bee and the closely related digging wasps require bare, sandy soil for nesting habitat. And the objective of this study was to form baseline data about the diversity and behavior of bees and wasps using these once historically abundant spaces as nesting habitat in a restoration setting. To do this, I surveyed 20 wallows in restored tallgrass prairie at the TNC's Nachusa Grasslands property in Illinois during the months of August and September. During these surveys, I sat and I observed nesting Hymenoptera for 15 minutes and recorded when individuals would physically go inside of a nest. This was followed by an hour of catching nesting individuals for later identification, and I did this by sitting at the edge of the wallow, waiting for a bee or a wasp to mosey on in, go into their brood cell or nest, and then I would place a vial on top of the nest entrance and wait for them to exit, and that's how I would catch them. And I also did a 15-minute photo survey, and this is where all the nice photos for this presentation came from. It would also help me orient to what parts of the wallow were the most active for my surveys. And then I also collected metadata such as the weather during the survey and physical attributes like the length, width, slope, aspect of the wallow, and etc. Although the specimens that were collected during this study are still being pinned and identified, I could still pull together some pretty interesting results from the data collected. During the 15-minute nesting observation surveys where there was no collecting taking place, I observed a total of 125 individual nesting hymenopterans across the 20 wallows, with an average of about 7 nesting individuals per 15-minute survey. And this essentially tells us that, yes, bees and wasps are using these unique spaces in a restoration setting as nesting habitat. And another, I think, pretty interesting statistic was the amount of the usually obscure parasitic bee species that I caught during each of the hour-long hand netting surveys. I'm going to return to that, though, in the next couple slides. So, for the rest of the time that I have with y'all, I'd really like to drive home the idea of how diverse these wallow systems really are. And not only in regards to the bee and wasp species that I found in them, but also just the complex interactions that are taking place between these species that are unique to these landscape features within the broader context of grassland ecosystems. And moving forward, I'd really love to see these wallows considered as an ecological phenomena that deserves and is worthy of more attention, in depth, and conservation. One of these interactions is kleptoparasitism, or brood parasitism. And what you're looking at here is a picture I took in a wallow. On the left, you have a brood parasitic bee in the genera Nomada looking at its host, on the right, which is a mining bee in the genera Andrena. And what's going to happen here is the mining bee is going to leave to go collect pollen to provision her brood cell. And while she's gone, the parasitic bee is going to enter her nest, crawl down in there, lay an egg, and that egg is going to hatch into a larvae that will eat the host's egg and grow into an adult. Pretty gnarly. But as I mentioned briefly earlier, these kleptoparasitic species of bee are generally pretty obscure, and they don't typically show up in large numbers in bee sampling efforts. But as you can see here from this graph, about a third of the species I collected during the 1 hour hand netting of nesting individuals were brood parasites. This makes sense, though, because of the high density of nesting individuals that I was seeing in these bison wallows. And this means that bison wallows could be a really interesting setting to study the natural history of brood parasitism in many different species of bee. And if you're a bee nesting in a bison wallow, coming home to the butt of a nomada in your nest after a long day of foraging, surprisingly, isn't the only thing you have to look out for. You also have to be aware of predators, such as this bee wolf in the genera Phyllanthus, that you can see here holding a paralyzed metallic green sweat bee. I also observed these wasps nesting in the same wallows as their prey, which adds a really cool layer of predation to these wallow ecosystems. And hey, why not add another level of kleptoparasitism? This is a satellite fly in the dipteran subfamily Miltograminae. They are known to be brood parasites of solitary bees and wasps. I often observe these creepy flies lurking behind bee wolves, looking for the perfect opportunity to sneak onto the bee wolf's prey and lay an egg before she enters her nest. More often than not, they're caught in the act, and the prey is ditched. And to complicate things even more, there are wasps that hunt the satellite flies. This means in these systems you have wasps that hunt the parasites that parasitize wasps that hunt bees. Pretty crazy. So in conclusion, today we learned that bison wallows are a unique ecological phenomenon, that they were once historically abundant in the North American grassland systems, and that these bare open spaces created by the bison's disturbance are valuable nesting habitat for both native bee and wasp species. And all of that is pretty dang cool in and of itself, but what I get the most jazzed about are the restoration applications of this research. Presently, much of pollinator restoration efforts focus on reestablishing floral diversity, but largely ignore nesting habitat. This research suggests that we should consider adding nesting habitat components to restoration efforts. A simple answer to this suggestion could be to just reintroduce more bison to more grassland restoration projects. But in most cases, this probably is not logistically possible. So in those cases, is it possible to recreate an artificial bison wallow? And if so, how do these artificial wallows differ from naturally created wallows? These are some questions that I would really love to research further and that get me really, really excited. And that's pretty much it for my presentation. So if you would like to email me with any questions or just to chat about this research or even from grad school opportunities, please do reach out. Other than that, I hope y'all have a beautiful winter. And goodbye. So